Just a few hours from now, something is about to happen in Italy that raises a profound question, not just for Italians, but for the future of democracy across the entire European continent. On the 22nd and 23rd of March 2026, Italy is heading to a constitutional referendum. The goal of this referendum is to amend the second and fourth titles of the Italian Constitution. This will be the fifth constitutional referendum in Italian history, but the real question is, what exactly is this referendum about? Why is it so deeply controversial? And most importantly, is judicial independence in Italy genuinely at risk? Let's understand this from the very beginning. The relationship between the judiciary and the government in Italian politics has never been smooth. This tension goes back primarily to the 1990s, when the famous Mani Pulite, or clean hands investigation, tore the mask off Italy's deeply corrupt political class. The sweeping corruption exposed in that investigation brought down the ruling Christian Democratic Party, along with several others. In the Berlusconi era that followed, the conflict between the judiciary and politics grew even more intense. Berlusconi himself repeatedly labeled judges as communists and accused them of political bias. The culture of calling judges red-robed from the right-wing camp continues to this day. It is against this long and turbulent backdrop that the so-called Nordio reform has emerged. Named after the current Justice Minister Carlo Nordio, this proposal seeks to restructure Italy's judiciary from its very foundations. So what exactly does this reform contain? The Nordio reform rests on three main pillars. First, the separation of the careers of judges and public prosecutors. Second, splitting the judiciary's self-governing council, the Consiglio Superiore della Magistratura, or CSM, into two separate bodies. Third, introducing a lottery system for appointing members to these bodies, alongside the creation of an independent high disciplinary court. Let us start with the first change. Historically in Italy, judges and public prosecutors belong to the same professional category. A person could begin their career as a judge and later transition into the role of a prosecutor, and vice versa. This reform seeks to permanently close that door. A definitive choice would have to be made right at the start of one's career. The government's argument is straightforward. Can a judge who previously served as a prosecutor truly deliver a verdict with genuine impartiality? Or will a prosecutor who was once a judge carry the shadow of that former role in their mindset? These questions may seem reasonable to many, but the opposition says this argument is essentially a smokescreen. The 2022 Cartabia reform had already limited career switches to just once. Real data shows that in each year between 2022 and 2024, less than 1% of judges or prosecutors actually changed careers. So if the problem had already been largely resolved, why does it require a constitutional amendment? Now let's turn to the second change, the splitting of the CSM. Currently, the CSM is the single self-governing council of the judiciary. This reform would divide that unified council into two, one for judges, one for prosecutors. At the same time, the CSM's disciplinary powers would be stripped away and handed to a newly created third body. The third change is the introduction of a lottery or sortition system for appointments. Currently, the judicial members of the CSM are elected by their fellow magistrates. Under the new system, this election would be replaced by a lottery. Non-judicial members, university professors and lawyers, would be selected by Parliament from a short list. Now we arrive at the most critical question. Does this reform genuinely threaten judicial independence? Concern about this reform has been expressed at the international level as well. Comparisons are being drawn between this reform and the attempts to impose political control over the judiciary seen in Poland, Israel, and Mexico. The Venice Commission, Europe's democratic standards watchdog, has expressed particular concern. According to Venice Commission principles, in countries that have judicial councils, at least half of the members should be elected by fellow judges. This reform runs directly against that principle. The arguments from the opposition deserve to be laid out more clearly. Opponents argue that the so-called closeness between judges and prosecutors, the charge being leveled, is no longer a real issue in practice. The true purpose of this reform, they say, is to weaken the judiciary and tilt the constitutional balance of power in favor of the executive branch. Italy's National Association of Magistrates and left-center opposition parties are fiercely opposing the reform. They allege that it will weaken the judiciary and effectively give the government control over criminal investigations. Opposition leader Elly Schlein has directly accused the reform of being a tool to place the government above the law and the Constitution. Another opposition leader, Giuseppe Conte, has called it an attempt to seize absolute power. And the government side? What is their position? Government circles claim that the judiciary has become excessively politicized and that judges are delivering verdicts for political purposes. Justice Minister Alfredo Mantovano has accused the courts of engaging in unlawful interference with government regulations. He has argued that immigration policy, security policy, and industrial policy have all been obstructed by judicial rulings. Supporters of the reform argue that separating careers will bring greater clarity of roles in criminal justice and strengthen the perception of judicial impartiality. They also contend that the lottery system for CSM appointments will reduce factionalism and that the creation of a separate disciplinary court will make accountability more credible. But against these arguments, experts warn that a lottery system could simultaneously reduce both expertise and accountability. This entire debate also has a vitally important political dimension. Since coming to power, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's government has earned a reputation as one of Italy's more stable governments, and her approval ratings are higher than when she first took office. Yet this referendum could become a high-stakes gamble for her, because referendums in Italy can easily transform into votes of no confidence against the sitting government. In this context, the memory of 2016 resurfaces powerfully. On the 4th of December 2016, then Prime Minister Matteo Renzi made the referendum a deeply personal issue, and after losing the vote, he immediately resigned. That defeat shook the government and accelerated a period of political restructuring. Meloni does not want to repeat that mistake. She has repeatedly stressed that this referendum is not a question of confidence in the government. It is purely a question of constitutional reform. Now let us turn to the procedural side of this referendum. This is a confirmatory referendum, because while the reform passed in Parliament by a simple majority, it did not achieve a two-thirds supermajority. Article 138 of the Italian Constitution provides for a referendum in such circumstances. The most striking feature is that this referendum has no quorum requirement, no minimum voter turnout threshold. A simple majority of valid votes cast is all that is needed. This particular feature is also shaping the political strategies of various parties. With no quorum requirement, parties are targeting specific segments of the population with their campaigns and placing heavy emphasis on explaining the substance of the reform. Some observers believe this procedure effectively transforms the referendum into a formality, more of a rubber stamp on a parliamentary decision than a genuine expression of popular will. The opposition camp extends well beyond political parties. It includes civil society at large. In January 2026, a broader coalition called Civil Society for No in the Constitutional Referendum was formed. This coalition includes legal scholars, civic organizations, constitutional experts, trade unions, anti-mafia groups, and environmental organizations. Most notably, approximately 117 constitutional experts have joined this coalition. Among them, 3 former presidents of Italy's Constitutional Court and 1 former vice president. That is no small thing. When the country's top constitutional scholars stand together in opposition to a reform, it is entirely reasonable to ask serious questions about it. Let us now go deeper into the historical context of this reform. During the fascist era, public prosecutors in Italy were subordinate to the executive branch. The democratic constitution of 1948 brought that arrangement to an end. Article 104 of the Constitution states explicitly that the judiciary is an autonomous and independent body from any other power. After the Second World War, Italy's constitution drafters made this provision with extraordinary care and deliberateness. They had witnessed firsthand how judicial independence had been stripped away under fascist rule, and what the consequences of that were. Today, any attempt to tamper with that foundation strikes many observers as not merely a legal concern, but a deeply historical one. The international relevance of this referendum is equally profound. In recent years, we have watched in Poland, Hungary, and several other countries as elected governments gradually eroded judicial independence, step by step, always in the name of reform. While the Nordio reform may appear limited on the surface, it is part of the Meloni government's broader strategy of institutional change, a strategy that also includes plans for the direct election of the Prime Minister and greater regional autonomy. When these three changes are viewed together, a larger picture comes into focus, expanding the power of the executive and diminishing the power of the other two branches, the judiciary and the legislature. Experts fear that taken as a whole, this reform will lead to the institutional weakening of Italy's judiciary. And it is against this backdrop of concern that the upcoming referendum carries such extraordinary weight. But we must also understand, with empathy, those who will vote in favor of the reform. Many ordinary Italian citizens are deeply frustrated with the judiciary. Legal proceedings take an extraordinarily long time. Cases drag on for years, sometimes decades. Being charged with corruption often means spending an eternity in the corridors of courthouses. When someone steps forward and says, "We will fix the system," people understandably see a ray of hope. But experts caution that citizens experience the justice system primarily in terms of its speed and predictability, and this constitutional restructuring will not address those real, lived problems. In other words, this reform does not answer the genuine complaints of ordinary people. It is pursuing a different agenda altogether, dressed in the language of fixing what is broken. Now we arrive at the most fundamental question of all. What outcome will this referendum produce? The referendum can shift the political winds dramatically. If the Meloni government loses, it may not directly force a resignation, but it will deliver a significant political blow and complicate the next steps of judicial reform considerably. And if the reform passes, then several critical questions will need to be answered through ordinary legislation. How many members will the new CSM bodies have? How many eligible candidates will be available for the lottery? What will the qualification criteria be? These details will ultimately determine the real-world impact of the reform. So where does all of this leave us? Every voter will have to answer one fundamental question. Will this reform enhance the protection of citizens in criminal proceedings while preserving the balance of powers and the independence of the judiciary? Or does it, beneath the surface of career separation, endanger precisely that balance and that independence? The very things already under assault in so many countries across today's world. There is no easy answer to that question, but its importance cannot be overstated. Democracy does not live in elections alone. Democracy is sustained by institutions that do not answer to any single power, but answer to the Constitution and to the law. The judiciary is the most important of those institutions. It is the last refuge, the place where even the powerful can lose to the powerless, if the law says so. Italy's referendum, then, is not only a matter for the Italian people, it may well become a signal for Europe and for the entire democratic world. On the 22nd and 23rd of March, the people of Italy will deliver their verdict. The rest of the world is watching.